Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening, everybody. But before we get cracking this evening and before our lovely host joins us, I want to remind you of our sponsor this evening, who are Pearson Edexcel, and their new student-centered French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent, accessible and allowing all students to showcase their language skills through inclusive and relatable content. And if you want to find out more about these GCSEs, you can go to go.pearson.com/MFL. Good evening, John. How are you?
Good evening, Lucy. How are you?
I'm all right, sir. How are you?
Yeah, fine. I was talking away there. It's always the way, isn't it, when you're first starting? Yeah, I'm really good, thank you. Looking forward to tonight. The person that we've got, Andrew Whitworth, I've admired from afar, so I'm really looking forward to kind of hearing what he has to say. We're going to be talking around curriculum tonight.
Fabulous.
So welcome to everyone who's listening live or listening in the future, which always kind of blows my mind that this could be listened to in a few days' time, a few weeks' time, a few months' time. So whoever's listening, welcome. Tonight we're going to be talking to Andrew Whitworth, as I've just mentioned. So just a little about me. My name is John B. I am currently a deputy head teacher in the northeast of England, as you can possibly tell by the accent. And my whole kind of thinking at the moment is around curriculum, in particular maths curriculum, but in a broader sense, I'm interested in curriculum in general. So welcome, Andrew.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Enjoying the holidays.
Yeah, I'm sure. Did you break up from Friday?
Yeah, we broke up. We had a half day on Friday.
I've heard of some schools doing that. I've never worked in a school that breaks up kind of midway through the day on the last day, but I'm there for it. Absolutely sounds like a great way to end the academic year. Andrew, over to you. If you would just like to kind of introduce yourself, kind of summarize who you are, what you're interested in, a little bit about your career and your background, just so the listeners can kind of place you.
So my name's Andrew. I'm an assistant head teacher in charge of teaching and learning at a school in Andover. I kind of do teaching, learning and also professional development across the school. I've been teaching for 16 years. So I started off in a school in Southampton, so secondary school, in quite a deprived area, so 65% pupil premium. I'm a history teacher by trade, so became a head of department, became a kind of director of humanities, and then I've kind of worked my way through. I've been in my current post for the last 4 years. I'm really enjoying it, and looking forward to this.
And are you primary or secondary, Andrew?
I'm a secondary teacher.
Okay, and so is it secondary history?
By trade, I'm a secondary history teacher, but I don't actually get to teach a lot of my own subject these days. So I teach a lot of geography and RE and other humanities subjects.
By choice?
By timetabling necessity.
Yeah. Okay. So not by choice.
No, by choice. I would love to teach my own subject, but part of the deal was that we help the timetabler out in when he's in need.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. I suppose you won't get any sympathy from me tonight. Obviously, I'm primary and have to teach everything.
Exactly.
So it's almost like stepping into my world, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, welcome, Andrew. As I was saying at the top of the show, I'm so thrilled. I've really admired some of your work from afar, particularly some of the research, bite-sized things that I've seen on your social media over the last few months. We're going to start the show with a short section that I like to call Desert Island Desks. So this is kind of thinking about your career and kind of your essential go-to items that you need in order to teach. What would you say your top 3 items are for classroom teachers, for you yourself, that you simply couldn't do without?
Oh, good question. I think for me, it would. It is a good question. I think for me, teaching is all about preparation. So I have to go in with my kind of prepared lesson and know exactly what I'm going to be doing. I think I've recently been using kind of mini whiteboards quite a lot, and also I guess the resources that I need for the lesson. So part of my job, I've got to, because of classroom constraints, I have to move around the school quite a lot. So making sure I've got the kind of materials I need, whatever it is for that lesson. For me, always have a bit of reading for purpose in my lesson. So that piece of reading material, I think, is kind of crucial and fundamental to most of my lessons. And then, yeah, I guess those things would be my essential items. I guess it would depend on the lesson, but yeah, those are my essentials.
So you have something for children to read in every lesson?
I try desperately for that to happen. I think, given the nature of the subjects I teach, so obviously at the moment geography, RE, a tiny little bit of history, those things lend themselves obviously to that. So I'm desperately trying. That's part of my kind of thing that I'm trying to build is making sure that is in every single lesson at the moment.
And can I ask, Andrew, what might that look like in a geography lesson?
In a geography lesson, it might look like a story. So if, for example, I've just recently been teaching about rainforests, and we have a story about one of the tribes and kind of deforestation. And then obviously what I try and do with that is have some key questions in there, have some key retrieval in the reading for purpose, and making sure that they've got the appropriate prior knowledge to actually access the piece of reading. So that's what it would be looking like in kind of my lessons. I work with a brilliant history teacher called Neil Bates, who does a lot of work with kind of the historical association, and his kind of life passion is kind of stories, and we're trying to integrate that more into kind of geography and RE, obviously to try and bring a bit more meaning to the lessons. I think, particularly with some of the, I don't want to offend geographers, but some of it can be a little bit dry, but that's obviously because I'm a historian. So when it's the physical geography aspects, we're trying to make it a little bit more meaningful to students. I've probably upset a load of geographers there, but
I'm sure not. Yeah, I think it's something that we see in primary as well. We try not only in English lessons to include texts where possible, but having a real kind of rich tapestry of texts across the whole curriculum in history, in science, and geography, and maths can be a really good way to do it. It's great to hear that actually that's something which is happening in secondary schools as well.
Yeah, I think, well, part of my remit has changed slightly next year. So I'm now going to be doing literacy across the school. So I wanted to try and kind of make sure that's embedded in my practice before I start, obviously, trying to put that out on a wider scale, because I'm a big believer that you've got to kind of practice what you preach, even as assistant head teacher. If they come into my lessons, exactly what I'm saying has to be what I'm doing. Otherwise, it doesn't have any kind of value.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so let's dive in. Just before we do, I'm going to read out a quick word from our sponsor. Pearson Edexcel's new student-centered French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the need of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learning language knowledge, their assessments are transparent, accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills through inclusive and relatable content. The new Pearson MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital which helps students develop an understanding and appreciation of the wider world. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to pearson.com/MFL. Okay, let's dive in, Andrew. I've just looked ahead at some of the topics that we're going to be speaking about tonight, and listeners, I'm sure, who are here to kind of hear about your thoughts about curriculum will be interested around, and some of the titles that you chose were really kind of really very carefully framed, I thought, and I think we'll get some really good discussion out of them tonight. So we've got, what is the curse of coverage? Why is getting it right at key stage 2 important? What's the importance of priming for learning? What is successive relearning? what is the lottery of circumstance? And I'm very intrigued about that one. And what role does research play in education? And finally, we're going to finish about avoiding dogmatic teaching approaches. So that's kind of where we're heading. That's going to be our coverage this evening. So, Andrew, let's start at the top. What is the curse of coverage?
Okay, right. So the curse of coverage, certainly, and I'll add a caveat to all of this. Obviously, this is from my interpretations of what I've read around education, obviously what I've experienced, and there are lots of people with far more knowledge than I have on these things. But for me, the curse of coverage is that tendency in curriculums to prioritize breadth of content over kind of a deep understanding and learning. So teachers might kind of rush through a topic in the curriculum, and that tends to lead to, I'd say, is more superficial learning, where we end up with lots of knowledge gaps. We end up with not a lot of durable learning, because actually those memories decay pretty quickly. And you've got this kind of priority of ticking off topics rather than ensuring that you've got a comprehensive understanding. And some of that, obviously, I know is driven by national curriculum and the need to obviously cover certain things within a national curriculum. But from my experience, particularly at Key Stage 3, there certainly used to be this big tendency in education to just kind of rush through a topic. So if you've got 12 lessons of a topic, you plan for 12 lessons, but you plan new content in all of those 12 lessons. You don't, after, let's say, 5 lessons, pause, just consolidate what you've already learned. You see the kind of end of, and this will come to successive relearning, see the end of the topic as kind of the end of the learning process, when actually the reality is that learning from kind of sciences of learning takes a great deal of time. So actually the end of a topic really is, you're only about, I want to say halfway through the learning process, but probably not even that. So actually you've got to come back to it. And if we want to, I guess it comes down to what you actually want from the learning process. So if you're trying to create what we say durable, meaningful, and learning that you can transfer in different circumstances, then actually you've got to have as much priority on that kind of vertical curriculum, so the depth of it, as you do the horizontal curriculum. Because obviously, if you don't do that, what you're not doing is you're not changing the long-term memory of the students. And if you're not changing it, you're not building the schemas they need for the next step. And you end up with quite a lot of wasted time, actually, where I think teachers, maybe new to the profession, I'm not saying experienced ones, will underestimate how quickly students forget things. And actually, you as a teacher, you're cursed by knowledge. So you think, because obviously you understand it and you know it in depth, that students are going to. But we know that obviously learning is invisible, so it's a really difficult job to make sure that obviously students are learning. And certainly, and I think there has been a shift in kind of the education world, but certainly historically, and certainly my experience from when I started teaching, was there was very much this, right, we've got to get through this topic, we've got to make sure that we've covered the information. And actually what we really want is obviously students to learn things. And that might mean that obviously you've got to make sacrifices with your decision making when you come to curriculum planning, because we all want to, as a historian, everything is important, and I could have a curriculum with every single thing in, but actually the reality is I'm going to have to make some sacrifices on things because I want students to learn. And I remember I used to work with kind of a kind of network of schools, and I'd go and visit some history departments, and they would cover, I don't know, Weimar Germany in a lesson, and you'd kind of cringe because you think, well, there's not really a huge amount of point in that, because they're not actually learning anything. You can say maybe to external people, oh yeah, we've covered that, but actually we want to do something more important than that. We want to actually try and change the memory of students. And so for me, the curse of coverage is still fairly prevalent in schools, and actually some of that is obviously the government insisting on these national curriculums that are heavy with content. Some of it, obviously, exam boards. There's been, for Key Stage 4, there's been a big change in the last few years in terms of the exam boards, and there's certainly in some of those exams far too much content for the learning to be actually valuable and durable. So yeah, that for me kind of summary of what the curse of coverage is.
And so, Andrew, how can we ensure that learning sticks and remains in children's long-term memory and that it's deep?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things, and obviously I might flit around, obviously. So I think this idea of kind of successive relearning is really important. So you've got to, firstly, I think, break down the key components that you actually consider to be portable knowledge. So we've been doing a piece of work on what is the portable knowledge that students need to carry forward, because it acts as the kind of foundation of the next step. So identifying those portable knowledge is really important. And then I think the reality is obviously retrieval, but not just retrieval. There's other mechanisms as well. So you've got to build in good retrieval processes. You've got to build in good space processes, good interleaving processes. You've got to see retrieval as more than just a kind of mechanical mechanism. So you've got to, your retrieval should be changing as the learning changes. So you should be building in opportunities for more elaborative retrieval, so the why stuff, and you should be building in kind of transference retrieval, where actually they're applying the knowledge in kind of different contexts, and not beating yourself up, I guess, as a teacher because you haven't covered everything. And that's difficult, and that means it takes a lot of kind of reflection, because you need to keep coming back to it. And that's why I guess that kind of thing, the curriculum is never finished, is so important, because actually you will learn very quickly, I think, actually how much you can do in a way that is more meaningful.
And if we don't get that right, Andrew, what's the impact that it has on children in Key Stage 2 or in Key Stage 3?
Well, I think this is the kind of crux, isn't it? That we know that what you are likely to get, there are still huge learning gaps in school. And if you come to education from a background that is potentially more disadvantaged, then you need that learning to be that type of learning, the durable learning, because actually what we end up getting if we continue to follow this kind of curse of coverage, is you end up getting an education system that only favors the ones who come from a more advantaged backgrounds, who have that cultural literacy at home. You end up with a system where students who, let's say, start with less prior knowledge never actually change their prior knowledge. And actually, if you get it right, what we want to do is obviously we want to change all of students' prior knowledge. So the reality of the curse coverage is what you get is this kind of static education system, where if you come in early as a student with higher prior knowledge, you're always going to remain that way. And if you're someone who's come in as a low prior knowledge, it's always going to remain that way. If you are somebody with SEND needs, you are more likely to obviously stay not being able to access the types of curriculum that we want. If you are from a pupil premium background, then again, that's going to have an adverse negative impact on you. So I think the impact of that is that actually you're not optimizing learning. You're not actually doing the things we talk about education research. You're not actually doing the things that the education research is suggesting. And actually, you end up with a system that we've always had. And actually what I think want from education is we always want to improve the education of our students. So as a profession, we want to get better and better at that. Same with any other profession. If you talked about medicine, obviously 20 years ago in medicine, they will constantly improve their practice. And I think that's what we as educators need to do, is obviously constantly improve our practice so that we optimize more every child's chances in terms of education.
Sure. You touched on earlier there a little bit around kind of breaking down ideas or breaking down learning into manageable chunks. And I'm just wondering around kind of, you mentioned that you are a secondary geography teacher.
Mm-hmm.
If you could speak to perhaps a year 6 teacher or a Key Stage 2 teacher, what would you say the key objectives, the key skills that you would want children to know in readiness for Key Stage 3?
Well, it's a very good question. Well, we'll add the caveat now that obviously I'm not an expert in geography by any stretch of the imagination. So my knowledge is not what a geographer would be. But I think it's a tricky one. For me, what currently happens, and I don't know from your experience, is there probably isn't enough communication between the kind of key stage 2, key stage 3 phases. You might have different experience from that and actually work quite closely with obviously the secondaries around your area, but certainly from what I've always seen is that transition isn't as smooth maybe as it could be. So as a geographer, what you'd want is obviously the ability, locational knowledge. You'd want some place knowledge. You'd want those kind of key concepts that they need. So some work around geographical field work in key stage 2, but obviously with the caveat that the key stage 3 teachers are going to need to retrieve that at the beginning of key stage 3 in order for that knowledge to stick. So I think, and there's lots of research around that kind of summer lag and that transition between key stage 2 and key stage 3, but actually a lot of that needs to be on the emphasis needs to be on secondary school teachers to get into primary schools and learn exactly what those primary schools are teaching, because the first, for me, in an ideal world, and this is obviously ideal world, the first 2 or 3, maybe 4 weeks of key stage 3, year 7, should be consolidating what they did in year 6, because if the teachers aren't doing that, then obviously that knowledge that the primary teachers have spent a huge amount of time trying to embed in their students is going to be lost. And that's not the primary school teacher's fault. It's just the fact that obviously that's what happens with memory, and we probably don't see enough, and this again from my experience, don't see enough of that communication between those kind of key stage 3 and key stage 2. And what I hate in education is this kind of, oh well, they can't have taught it, or you've got to be a bit more joined up in the thinking around it.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree that we still haven't got it right from year 6 to year 7 in that transition. I'm wondering, Andrew, based on your experiences, what the transition from key stage 3 to key stage 4 looks like.
So transition to key stage 3 and key stage 4 is an interesting one, because obviously you effectively start a new course in key stage 4, and what you want to do in the secondary school is you want to try and make sure that the foundational knowledge of key stage 3 is there to then build on. Ofsted have got this big insistence, obviously, on, I think rightly so, on making sure that obviously you get a decent breadth at key stage 3, and that you don't start teaching the explicit topics from key stage 4 and key stage 3. But again, I think I was just talking with my partner, who's also a history teacher, earlier on about this, that seeing those two things as kind of, in my ideal world, I'd get rid of the labels key stage 3 and key stage 4, because actually if you're going to get learning right, it is a process that takes 5 years. It's your first lesson in year 7 should be just as important as your last lesson in year 11 in terms of learning. So what we tend to get in the key stage 3, key stage 4 is you tend to get lots and lots of coverage of breadth at key stage 3, probably too much so. And then key stage 4 is almost seen as this kind of unique thing, where obviously schools are trying to prepare them, but obviously they see it as this kind of unique thing. And actually, if you're going to get it right, I think what you've got to do is obviously break down that like we said, that portable knowledge in key stage 3 to then build on that at key stage 4. So not repeating topics, but certainly having an understanding that all learning at key stage 4 is predetermined basically by what you do at key stage 3. Because if they don't have the right prior knowledge, then actually, again, even at key stage 4, that's going to be superficial. And what you tend to get at key stage 4 is too much content in the exam specs, and therefore you get coverage, and teachers will work very, very hard to make sure they cram and make sure all the students cram all the knowledge, and it's there in some guise for the exam. So they've crammed it. We've all probably done that in exams. We've all crammed and we pass exams because we can cram, but actually then what happens is that knowledge is not durable, not particularly meaningful, and then you get this again as this kind of gap between key stage 4 and key stage 5. So I think teachers try their hardest at key stage 3 to make sure they're prepared at key stage 4, but I think obviously if you don't get that cursor coverage that we were talking about earlier, right, then I think you're likely to find problems again at key stage 4, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm just going to segue into a quick note from our sponsor before we move on to the next spectrum. So this show is brought to you in partnership by the Happy Confident Company, who provide clinically approved and ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programs to help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. And you can visit www.happyconfident.com to find out more. I hope you're enjoying the podcast. Right, Andrew, the next kind of area that I would like you to talk around is priming for learning. So can you just tell us what priming for learning is?
Yeah, sure. So priming for learning is trying to make sure that you optimize the chances of learning. Now, we know from the research, learning is this invisible kind of construct. So actually, it's very difficult to do. But actually, we also know, and Sarah Cossingham's done some great work around this, you also know that actually there are things that we can do to increase the chances of them learning in the first place. So one of those key bits, I guess, would be the activation of the appropriate prior knowledge. So if you want learning to happen, if you want to encode learning, you want to be connecting your new piece of information to obviously your prior knowledge. So that's the way we encode to start with. And also that's the way as kind of humans we make meaning of things. And when we use the word understand, what we're actually talking about there is obviously something has registered it from our previous knowledge, obviously with the new information. So that's given us a level of understanding. So I think one of the key things is you've got to activate the appropriate prior knowledge. So for every lesson, I would strongly advocate that obviously teachers have really thought about what it is that you're going to connect to. Just as much as the new content, you actually need to consider what the actual knowledge you're going to connect to. And obviously you said you were a maths specialist, so obviously crucial in maths. You've got to make sure that those foundations are there before you go on to the next bit. I won't give examples because I don't have that level of expertise, but you've got to make sure obviously you're activating it and taking that deliberate time in a lesson to actually do that, rather than just rushing in to introduce the new concept. You've actually got to just make sure, spend time, and if it takes more time, then it takes more time. So if it does take, let's say you've got an hour lesson and it does take half an hour, well, so be it, because ultimately that means you're going to be optimizing the chances of learning. I think there's a couple of other ones that are quite important with priming for learning as well. I think we do a lot of work around kind of cognitive science and things, but actually students have to cognitively engage with this material, and actually you're far more likely to do that if you value the thing that's being presented to you. So actually taking the time to make sure that students value or are intrigued or they're curious about that information is really important as well. And I think sometimes, and it could be 100% wrong, but sometimes in this drive for kind of cognitive science and all these sciences, we forget that actually those kind of human sciences of actually making sure they value it is really important as well. Because if you value something, if you are good at something, if you have that self-efficacy about something, you're far more likely to actually put in that kind of mental work in order for it to happen. So for me, activating prior knowledge, making sure that obviously they value it, and also being really explicit on the links between the prior knowledge and the new knowledge. So your organization of that knowledge is obviously really important as well, because if you overload it, and I know your listeners probably know lots and lots about cognitive load theory, but if you're overloading that knowledge, then obviously it's less likely to integrate as well. So if you that first step, and I would say this is really important, and maybe an area that obviously more work needs to be done on, but that first step in terms of the learning is making sure you've got the right knowledge, so they're activating the prior knowledge, making sure they value it, and making sure you've organized it in a kind of coherent structure. Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to try and build that into the schema of those students. So obviously they need to know where that fits. So things like, I don't know, there's much debate around kind of learning objectives, but I think they're quite important. I don't think writing it down or any of that, but actually the students being aware of exactly what you're learning and where it's connecting to is really important if we want to try and optimize the chances of that happening.
I wonder, Andrew, if you might be able to give us an example of what priming for learning looks like in your classroom in a typical day.
Yeah, sure. So if I was doing a history lesson, for example, and let's say I was looking at interpretation of sources. So I wanted my students to be able to look at a couple of interpretations of sources and maybe try and analyze it. So firstly, obviously, with all skills, they are not generic. So interpretation, say you've got interpretation skills, has to be grounded in a topic. So if I was doing it around, let's say, the British Empire and views on the British Empire, and looking specifically at India. So firstly, I would need to create a resource where I've got my key questions around what I have previously taught them around the British Empire and India. So some kind of fundamental questions. And also then obviously need to have broken down their understanding of the word interpretation, and not just the word, but obviously what processes you would actually do in order to come at an interpretation. So looking at kind of the authorship of the historian, looking at any potential subjective natures of that, looking at what skills I need to bring to that. Also, I would then have on there the tier 2 words that I would like to use, obviously, in terms of analysing that source, because I think if they don't have the words to obviously do it, then they're not going to be able to do it. So I would set up a quick kind of retrieval exercise, but with the very mindful approach of knowing that I needed to break down exactly the bits in order to build the comprehension for them to then understand the next process. So that's kind of what it would look like. But then obviously I would then probably move on to the process of looking at why this is important and actually trying to potentially link it to, I don't know, the diverse nature of British society, or trying to link it to a view around actually looking at empire in a kind of the good and the bad sides of empire, and making sure that they've got a kind of an awareness of those kind of awareness of kind of what Britain did as well. So I think that for me, I would spend probably in my lesson at least 20 minutes doing that before I even then look at the new bit of information, because like I said, I want to try and avoid that curse of coverage. So not only is it a good opportunity to retrieve information, but obviously it gives me as a teacher the good opportunity to assess what they already know. And then if I'm doing it right, then I need to obviously try and make adaptations based on that. So I'm going to look at what their knowledge is. If they don't know it, then obviously I'm going to need to change my lesson, because they're not going to be able to do the next bit. And I think sometimes I work quite closely with a lot of our ECTs and ITT students as well. And sometimes that's kind of a piece of information I think is really crucial for them, is that don't be afraid to go off the lesson plan, because actually you've got to base it on that prior knowledge. And yet you might have tried to assess their prior knowledge previously, but actually in that real time moment, if it's not quite where we'd want it to be, then you need to make the kind of necessary changes to your lesson in order for that to happen.
Sounds like a really good way of checking for understanding at the start of a lesson, really eliciting kind of what children can remember, I suppose. In primary, I think we do that quite well in most cases. I think we do it particularly well in English and maths. Obviously, that's taught every day, perhaps in science, history and geography. And it's certainly something that the wider curriculum is getting a lot more attention now in primary. And we're really trying to revisit ideas so that the children know more, remember more, and can do more. And it sounds like a very similar approach. And I think you're right that it does kind of link to assessment for learning. You're checking all of the time what the children know, and then, as you say, you can direct the learning. Well, you may have to teach the previous lesson again if they haven't remembered anything. Hopefully they have. But yeah, it's about remembering the foundations, and then hopefully the succession of the next part of what the children are learning comes afterwards, which kind of leads me nicely into successive relearning. Are you able to tell us a little bit about what successive relearning is, Andrew?
Yeah, I absolutely can. Could I just have a couple of more bits on that previous one that we've just said? Just I think there's a couple more bits. I think.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. What you were saying is absolutely right. I think key stage 2 in primary sector, you absolutely get that right. And I think the beauty that you have in primary is obviously you see those students potentially a lot more than obviously they will see them in secondary school. So you've got I would say by and large, you would have a better understanding of their knowledge gaps, a better understanding of kind of what skills they've developed. And then you can, and I think they do that very well in primary school, you can make those kind of necessary adaptations. I think what's interesting, and I don't have answers to this, I think what's interesting in key stage secondary school, is that potentially if I'm teaching RE, I'm going to have that class once a week, maybe. And what tends to happen is teachers get very don't know what the word is, but teachers are then very worried about the kind of content coverage, because if you've only seen them once a week and you then have to spend, like you said, 20 minutes, or then have to actually go, oh God, actually they didn't learn, they can't remember anything from 2 weeks ago, which is likely because obviously a 2-week lag in something is quite a long time in the secondary education sector, where they've had potentially 25 other lessons in the meantime. Then what can happen at secondary schools is that people get very worried about that and therefore rush it because of that. And I completely understand that they kind of rush that process as a consequence of just panicking. Right, okay, if I spend too long kind of checking for understanding, then actually I'm never going to get move through this kind of horizontal curriculum that I've got kind of national curriculums to cover. So you get a problem in key stage 3 particularly, I think, and key stage 4, when that stops happening as a consequence of the kind of time constraints. And I know obviously in the primary sector you have lots and lots of time constraints as well, and I'm sure lots of your teachers will think, oh God, if only I had a little bit more time on that, would be able to actually build that in a bit better. I think the other interesting thing, and again, I'm not saying I've got any answers to these, is that it's very difficult to decide at what point all of your class have got it. So ultimately what we want students to do is we want them to master the material, but you also are going to have potentially 30 students in a class. Now, that's 30 students with very differing levels of prior knowledge. So at what point, and I'm not saying I know the answer to this, at what point do you decide that you need to move on, and what point do you decide you need to redo it, and how many of those 30 students, because it's probably very likely there will always be some in that class who don't get it, particularly in primary schools. You have, and I'm a big advocate of kind of mixed ability classes. So you've got mixed ability classes with that whole range of kind of prior knowledge coming there. So at what point do you do it? And then, and I know differentiation's obviously kind of gone from the kind of Ofsted framework as a word, but because obviously what it tends to then do is lead to quite unsustainable practices, because you then have to differentiate your learning for very different prior knowledge. So it's quite I think it's a really complex kind of process, and I'm not saying I've got the answers to this at all, but obviously schools themselves need to decide, and teachers as kind of autonomous beings need to decide at what point. And those can be quite difficult decisions, because there will be students who think actually they haven't got it, but for the need of the other 28 in the class, I'm going to have to move on.
Yeah, and it comes back to assessment time and time again. And I think, I suppose I've never really thought of it from a secondary point of view, but actually, having 25 lessons in between is a huge amount of time to remember what happened in, the British Empire 500 years ago. It's a great deal to really think about, and I think that's why retrieval is so important. I think from a primary level, Andrew, we know the children, we know them well, we see them every day. So we can kind of drip feed things if we need to for 5 minutes a day, if we know it's important and we want it to stick. I guess that's perhaps the difference really between primary and secondary education. Just the sheer volume of time that we spend with the children is obviously different.
Yeah, I think you get, and it is really interesting from a kind of learning, like purely theoretical kind of learning perspective. So obviously what we tend to have is you will have and I'm sure exactly the same obviously at primary school, but they will have far more time obviously with their English, maths and science teachers, which means that obviously those individuals can do that, can drip feed for 5 minutes a day, because they will see them pretty much every day. It's maybe one or two differences, but it's those subjects where they have far less curriculum time. So the arts, the REs, that actually, from a learning perspective, are always going to be fighting a harder battle because they've got that natural lag. And you sometimes have to say to teachers, and teachers, it's a very obviously personal profession, isn't it? So they're sometimes quite upset. Obviously, their students haven't remembered that thing from 2 weeks ago that obviously is so important to them as teachers, because they've chosen that subject to study at university, to go on. But actually, you want to say to them, actually, it's just a natural process. It's nothing you've done wrong. It's just that's going to happen.
Yeah, sure. And I think you're right. It is part of the process to learn something, to know something. You have to forget it. And in order to remember that, you need to be able to either relearn it or remember it or reenact it. Which kind of brings us on, Andrew, to the question that I asked a few moments ago about this idea of successive relearning. Can you just talk to us about what that means?
Yeah, I think it very much is kind of touching upon what we've already been talking. So I think successive relearning is this phrase that's used by a few kind of educationalists that kind of encompasses a lot of what we've been talking about. It encompasses that kind of priming for learning. It encompasses spacing and interleaving and retrieval, and it's kind of an approach where I'll just run through kind of what you're going to be focusing on is number one, you're going to focus on the fact that decay of memory is going to happen. Like you said, you've got to forget things to remember things, which seems kind of alien to kind of the average person, but to the teaching community, obviously, you know that's going to happen. You've then got to make sure that you've got a very clear plan on that kind of spacing of that information. So when are you going to revisit it? So if I was teaching in, I don't know, a piece of information that I knew was absolutely crucial in year 7, well, what I then need to have done is actually mapped out for the next 3 years when I'm going to actually be returning to that knowledge, because I know that my teacher, my Key Stage 4 teacher, needs that when the students are in year 11, potentially. So in 4 years' time. So I've got to then have spaced out, right, how am I going to come back to this? And obviously, in an ideal world, what you want to do is when you're coming back to it, you're not just merely repeating it, you're actually building on it. So you space out, but then you've got to try and build in this, I think they call it elaborative or elaboration. So you want to be building on that knowledge. And I think sometimes when people do retrieval, forget that actually you're going to try and make it a little bit harder every time and try and build that knowledge so you can have a bit more depth every time. So that's really important. You've got to make sure that obviously you're organized with the knowledge, how things fit together. So if you want to encode it properly, you've got to make those links. I know the primary section is exceptionally good at this, making those links between not just topics, but subjects as well. You've got to have got a very clear retrieval plan, but that needs to be adaptive, because obviously it's one of those debates of, do you have a kind of rigid retrieval plan, or do you have some kind of topic overview of retrieval, but then make sure that you've built in enough time to obviously adapt to certain classes? So I've got 3 different RE classes, and actually their knowledge, they've been taught the same content, but obviously their knowledge bases are very different. They're just different classes, they're seen at different times, they've got varying levels of different prior knowledge. So making sure that obviously you've built that in. You then got to try and make sure that when you are coming back to knowledge, what you're doing is really being really clear on that knowledge and how that knowledge not only links, but obviously is different as well, because I think they call it the interference principle, where obviously if something is too similar, it's likely that you're going to either confuse it or build a misconception. And then again, what you've got to do kind of at that final stage is you've got that kind of variability. So you've got to have built in opportunities for them to use that knowledge in lots of various contexts, and the more context you can use it in, the better. And we sometimes, in this again kind of theoretical debate, have this debate around, in theory, because you build in, when you're learning a new piece of information, you're taking in a lot of context from your environment. So learning something in one classroom, actually you might find it far more difficult to retrieve it in another classroom. So if your end goal is to make that knowledge more transferable, where you can actually use it in various contexts, actually probably the optimal thing to do is change the classroom every time. But obviously that's an impractical thing that schools can't do, and it'd be mad. But from a purely kind of learning perspective, that's probably the best thing. So it's that understanding that you're never done with a topic. Because of the learning process, you're never done with the learning, because you can always come back to it and you can always build more depth. I think people sometimes think that this kind of retrieval and successive relearning is boring, but actually they're missing the step of, well, the retrieval should be changing. It should be getting more difficult. It should be getting more elaborate, so that the students can ultimately use that knowledge in kind of various contexts.
Yeah, that makes quite a lot of sense to me, and I can really liken that from a primary perspective, when children are very first starting to learn the concept of shapes. So if you imagine a 4 or 5 year old, when they start primary school, starts to get an idea of what a square is. And will start to generalize. But if you only show children one orientation of a square, they'll have a very fixed idea of what a square can look like. And when you show children a square which is in a different orientation, then children can become quite confused, and it can become the same. You know, you think about things that are not as familiar as a square. If we think of something like a pentagon, as soon as you show children, you know, how many primary school teachers in early years of Key Stage 1 show the same pentagon and the same orientation all the time. And as soon as they get to Key Stage 2 and it's in a regular shape, but it's not in the context that they're familiar with, they have no idea what that shape is. It's a similar kind of idea, I suppose, to what you were talking around there. As it happens in maths, we call that variation theory. And it's the theory of kind of stripping things right down to the essential and fundamental things that make that concept. So it can be as simple as kind of adding in colour and asking children, well, does the colour actually change the fact that it's a pentagon? Well, no, it doesn't. And you know, and just having those conversations and around different ways of representing things, and I guess that will feed into successive learning in a little way.
Yeah, I think that's important. And actually, I think it's very interesting. And again, these are areas I'm not making any or laying any claims to expertise in, but that kind of certainly an area I'd like to look into more, about the kind of context when you encode that information in the first place. That context is actually probably more important than we think. And actually, in primary schools, and we tend to get it at secondary schools probably less so, that you have obviously have a lot of responsibility for that one class. And actually, the even kind of the words you use to explain something are going to be slightly different from, we're all individuals, are going to be slightly different from one of your colleagues. And actually, if those students move on to a different teacher, let's say they go from year 4 to year 5, well, actually the problem is then going to be the prompt. So I know that kind of Dan Willingham does a lot of work around this. He said he tends to be, and again, this is what my interpretation of it, he tends to think that actually forgetting happens, absolutely, but a lot of the problem sometimes is that the students don't have the right kind of internal prompt to bring that information back. So actually the information is there, it hasn't actually decayed, but actually the way your colleague is explaining it is different. Even though the fundamental might be the same, it's slightly different from how you've explained it, and therefore their internal prompt isn't quite there to do it. I know as history teachers, we tend to all have those kind of little gambits that we use and little stories that we use when we explain things. And again, I'm sure absolutely the case with you, you've got your bank of kind of analogies and metaphors and to actually get over the ideas, but actually your colleagues are going to have slightly different ones. And then actually that, from a learning point, becomes quite difficult for students because they know the information, but you just haven't used the right prompt to do it. So I guess it's like anything, isn't it? It's when you're talking with somebody and you're trying to remember an actor from a film, and actually you'll have those people that you know really well who will be able to prompt you better because you've kind of lived those experiences with them, and you think, oh yes, of course it's that, whereas somebody else might not have that. So I think kind of context, I know this is slightly off of successive relearning, but obviously context is a really interesting one that I think as teachers we've only really kind of just scratched the surface of.
Thank you. Just a word from our sponsor at this point of the podcast. So Pearson EdXL's new student-centered French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater for the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent, accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills through inclusive and relatable content. The new Pearson MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation of the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL. Thank you, Andrew. We're talking there a little bit around context, and I suppose really that is very much dependent on the circumstance in which you find yourself in. And I'm wondering if you could talk us around what the lottery of circumstance means for children.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of very much grounded in certainly my own kind of personal views around education, and certainly the school that I previously worked in. So I worked in like I said, a school which had about 65% pupil premium, and was a very challenging environment, but obviously a very rewarding environment. So I worked there for 13 years, and I wouldn't have done that if I didn't love it. And then I moved to a slightly different school with a different context, lower pupil premium. And I think for me, it certainly has solidified this idea of kind of lottery of circumstance. So what it effectively means is that old kind of way we were talking about teaching, where it's that kind of cursed coverage and you go through material and you don't take the time, works better or has less of a negative impact on students who will come with more prior knowledge. And obviously you're likely to come with more prior knowledge if you've grown up in a family where they value education, where there are books in the home, where they have gone on trips and holidays and have been able to build a more complex kind of schema that they've been able to use and utilize in the classroom, and also things like homework, and obviously making sure, and those parents valuing homework, valuing obviously the support from the school, valuing those teachers. And what we know we've got in this country is this very wide gap between our most advantaged and most disadvantaged in terms of education, and a lot of that is kind of predicated on this lack of prior knowledge, and I build in kind of literacy with that as well. We know obviously this Matthew effect, that actually knowledge begets knowledge, and students who already come with those higher levels of reading are more likely to be successful in school. And I think for me, certainly, it's about trying to build in practices that are more likely to improve the education of all students, regardless of background. And I think those practices we've been talking about tonight are more likely to try and narrow that education gap that we know is a big issue. We know because of the pandemic it got worse, and the lottery of circumstances is trying to understand that actually you've got to spend more time on that, because you're trying to change the schemas of all your students. And if you don't do that, if you don't do successive relearning, if you do overload students, if you go through your content curriculum horizontally, then you are more likely to be disadvantaging the already disadvantaged students. So I think kind of the power of certainly education research is that we are, and I don't think we're there by any stretch of the imagination, is we are starting to understand more those processes of learning, and therefore that will have obviously a more beneficial impact on all of our students rather than it not doing. And I think that kind of how do I word this? So one of the big things that people will often say when we say about education research and trying to change the practices, and there's this kind of potential view that, well, why did you need to do that? Because actually 25 years ago this worked for me, so I don't know why do we need to change these things, and I've always done it this way. But actually that benefits those who have greater prior knowledge. It benefits those who come with that kind of cultural literacy that some of our students don't. So actually making sure that you are aware of that and that your curriculum therefore adapts to that is really important. So I certainly have seen that in kind of the two schools I've worked in. Little things like my previous school, it was very, very, very difficult to ever run a trip abroad. So I think we did a history trip once to Krakow, and we took 7 students because that's all we could get to go on that trip financially, because obviously it's very difficult. Whereas at my new school, they're usually oversubscribed, and that's therefore we've got to try and look at what our education can do to actually try and close those kind of educational gaps.
And do you think there's anything else that schools, government, policymakers, teachers can do to level the playing field a bit more?
It's a very good question. I think there are probably lots of things that people could do. I think if we talk just from a purely teaching perspective, from a school's perspective, obviously what you've got to try and do is obviously prioritize all students, and it becomes very difficult. And these are, well, why did that student get that and that student not get that? And those can be very difficult processes. I think let's take it from a classroom perspective. I think what we've discussed is what teachers can do on the kind of ground, and I think that's really important. I think making sure that you prioritize successive relearning, rather than, I think at one point people had to put make sure you color your premium person on your sheet or something, and that's going to somehow miraculously change things. And obviously that's a nonsense. So, but actually those kind of fundamental changes of what you're doing in the classroom, they can start having an impact, because as teachers, I know we'll obviously get frustrated with these things, but obviously we are limited, I guess, in terms of what we can do on those big decisions. I think from schools' perspective, from teachers' perspective, I guess, and it's really difficult, because you can make obviously reasonable adjustments, and that's what schools do, but it is very frustrating sometimes if you've set homework and that child hasn't done it. Well, actually of course that's going to be really frustrating, but actually that child might not have a desk at home to work with. He might not have, or she might not have, a room where they can actually sit and do that. So it's setting those expectations, but obviously making sure that you don't rely on that. And I think, and this is a personal thing, I'm not a big lover of homework. I don't think it's done very well. I think the research is pretty dubious on homework, and I think all it does is kind of, particularly at secondary school, and I can't speak for Key Stage 2, is kind of you almost abdicating the responsibility of the learning. So teachers say, well, why didn't they do very well in that exam? Well, they didn't revise, they didn't do the homework. Well, yes, they didn't, but that's because of very certain reasons. So actually what you need to do as a teacher is to make sure you're optimizing learning in your actual lessons. I think that's the kind of the fundamental thing we can do as teachers.
It's possibly the only thing we can do as teachers is to try and have an impact in our own classroom. I mean, that's the dream, really.
Yep.
It's what we're there for. It's what we're hoping for. Yeah, it's interesting when we're talking about homework. I've had contrasting experiences, really, Andrew. I've worked in schools that have been very assertive on homework and insistent that it's back. I've worked with a head teacher who got rid of homework altogether because they thought it was a waste of time. And so really the jury's out. The impact on outcomes was not really that different when we had homework against not having homework. So it's a really interesting discussion that I think we could certainly have. Just thinking, just there on research, what role do you think research actually plays in education, and which research do we choose? There's a whole host of questions. It's really at the start of my thinking. Essentially, the question is around what role does research have in education?
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good question. I think the reality is that it could have a very powerful impact, but obviously what we've got to be careful of with any of this research is the kind of validity of it, and we've also got to be mindful that these are current, and we always try and say to staff, these are current best bets. So trying to maybe get away with the idea that this is definitely a thing, and this, if you do A, it will lead to B, is obviously not a thing really. And I know Dylan Wiliam does a lot of work around this about kind of context being really important. I think the main difficulty is that it is a time thing. So and I'm sure your primary colleagues are absolutely the same as all colleagues, that we are a time deficient profession. So teachers on a very, very busy day will have very, very little time to actually engage with a kind of plethora of information. And I think there's almost a kind of saturation of kind of education research out there at the moment, where it then becomes very difficult. If you're a teacher and you've got a near on full timetable, and you've got to deal with parents, you've got to deal with obviously students' behaviour, you've got to deal, then actually saying, oh yeah, I'm going to make some time on Friday to go sit down and read some education research is difficult, and probably is unrealistic. So I think the role it can play is important, but I think we've just got to be mindful that obviously it is there, but obviously we've got to be, I think as a profession, we've got to be very inquisitive about it, but obviously a little bit cynical as well, not in terms of not accepting it, but in terms of questioning it. So I obviously was in the phase where we all did brain gym, and we all did these kind of practices that we were told on our PGCE that were, yeah, of course they're research informed, and we know that a lot of that's been widely debunked. So I think it's got a really important role, but I think trying to navigate it is really difficult for schools. And obviously we've got this new research informed view from Ofsted. I know obviously they've just made a new appointment at the head of Ofsted, so I don't know if that view is going to change maybe over the next couple of years, but it's quite it's lengthy, I would say, the research, and therefore we've got to try and make sure, some of the stuff I've been trying to do is try and make sure it's a little bit more digestible for teachers. So I often feel very sorry for my primary colleagues, is they introduced those Ofsted research reviews, which were huge kind of research reviews for each of the different subjects. And actually, as a primary colleague, obviously you're going to be teaching all of those, and actually no one on earth has got the time to read all of those things and kind of synthesize those and then make practical applications in the classroom. It's completely unrealistic. So we've got to try and question it, but also introduce it, question it, but also it's got to have to be in kind of small doses, because actually the profession doesn't have the time at the moment to prioritize those things. Most people are working evenings, they're working weekends, so actually it is unrealistic to then introduce a load of new things that we place on teachers, and obviously sometimes that can be done badly. And I think I guess my advice would be, if you're a school, you pick one or two things, one ideally, and you prioritize that. So let's take retrieval, for example. Now, retrieval can have a really positive impact. We know that the evidence would suggest that it can have a really positive impact, but that impact will only happen if it's implemented really well. And actually just saying, oh, we do retrieval, well, actually it might not have any impact at all if they've not actually done it in a way that works and is informed. And that topic alone is a huge topic. So actually dedicating that time just to that one thing might be the thing that means you can do something a bit more sustainable, I think is a really important word in education. So if a practice is not sustainable, then there's probably not a lot of point in doing it in the first place. And we've all gone through those phases. If you've been teaching a certain period of time, you've gone through those phases where there are fads and schools introduce things, and then within a year everyone's kind of forgotten about it because they've moved on to a new thing, or it's not been done particularly well. So I think for me it should have a very powerful impact, but it's going to have to be done in a very careful way.
Yeah, I think I really like your point on being critical around the research that we're engaging with. I think there is a danger of still doing things because Ofsted have created a research summary of a subject, or the latest EEF document says such and such on behaviour, so therefore schools jump on that and think. And I think really it comes down to knowing that you can pretty much find research to contradict almost anything in education, and it's just kind of how do we know what we don't know, which is of course impossible. It's about having a rationale really behind why we want to do something, what the problem is, how we're going to improve it, and how research might be able to support that. But of course, research can never take into account your own context unless we start and view our researchers, our teachers as researchers, and they would be the ones doing all of the action research in a context with support from other professionals. And I suppose this really is where the research schools are coming from and the research informed practice. But I think you're right. I think there is a real danger of kind of looking at research and just taking it off the peg, so to speak, and then trying to apply it and hoping that it works. Under the illusion of when Ofsted do come calling, you could say, well, we've designed this using this research and it ticks a box. And that's the opposite kind of, it's the wrong way really of using research. When done right, I think it can be very powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree with your points there. I think it's a really interesting one of whether teachers are. There's lots of discussion about it, whether teachers are researchers. I think a lot of researchers say, well, they're not because they don't do X, Y, and Z. I know I did some course once at Southampton University on kind of the protocols of research, and actually it's quite rigid in terms of what you should be doing. So what type of research are you doing? I think your point is crucial there about a lot of research you can find to disagree with other research. So setting is a really good example, and I don't want to get into debate, but for everything I've read, obviously it is not conclusive either way. It is not conclusive whether obviously streaming works, or it's not conclusive whether mixed ability classes work. So you then have to make kind of moral decisions as a school on whether you think that thing is right for the students at your school. So setting would be a prime example. The research is contradicting both ways. It's pretty it's a very grey area. So you as a school then obviously have to make a moral decision about actually what do you want. So you might think that actually you've got a problem with your low learners, or I hate the term low learners, so ones who come with less prior knowledge. So you might have a problem with those who come with less prior knowledge, and that needs to be your fundamental aim to improve at the school. Well, mixed ability set is probably going to be a better thing for that. You might have an issue where actually it's your students who have got higher prior knowledge that's the issue, and therefore a different approach might be taken. So I think that's really important. I think it's absolutely, like you said, I think we've got to be critical consumers of the research, and also know how little we know as teachers, because there's so much out there, and there's some obviously brilliant people like kind of Dylan Willing and Sarah Cotty, and all those kind of people who really understand that stuff at kind of that different level. But actually, as classroom teachers, what do we know that we can obviously introduce in a practical sense? Because we've got to make it practical, and we've got to make it try and have some impact on students. And again, what can we do that's sustainable? So, for example, let's take Rose and Shine, for example. So obviously, and I'm not critical of that approach. That's lots of research around that approach, but I think there's lots of schools that have jumped on board this. Well, we're a Rose and Shine school. okay, fine, but do you know the work of David Asabel? Do you know the work of this thinker and this thinker to contrast that, or maybe add depth to the work of Rosenstein? You might be good at kind of that instruction element, but actually, is he the person that's going to be really good in improving your literacy standards? Well, actually, what's the research show you about reading? Well, actually, Rosenstein's not going to solve that problem. So you're going to need to look at a breadth of kind of research to come up with a solution that might be more sustainable.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I suppose one of the dangers might be, could we be in a position as a profession where actually the consumption of research leads to very dogmatic teaching approaches?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, because obviously you're on Twitter and I'm on Twitter, and it can be brilliant, but obviously there can be lots of spats within the teaching community itself, which I don't think are particularly helpful. So I think, and one of those problems I think is that teachers have tended to take fairly dogmatic approaches based on research, but actually we're only really, as a profession, just scratching the surface on kind of the research. So I read a really good blog piece the other day. I can't remember who it was from, but it was talking about trying not to be too dismissive of what came before, because what will happen is in 10 years' time, the people 10 years' time will look back at us and go, well, what the hell were they thinking? Why did they do that? Why did they introduce that? That was a stupid idea. And actually, there can be a bit, I think, at the moment of, we're at that phase where we're trying to introduce research, and what you end up with is new teachers, so ECTs, who've got a kind of new framework that is more based on research, and you've got very experienced teachers who might not know that research, but their research is obviously what they've lived and breathed over X amount of years. And obviously what you tend to get differing views on it. Me and a colleague were talking about this the other day, because we do a lot of the things that the ECF would recommend now, but we said, well, we got there through trial and error. We got there through those kind of exam results. Sometimes you think, oh god, that wasn't great. Okay, what can I do to fix this? Whereas obviously we're trying to fast track those teachers a little bit more in terms of what practices might be less effective. So I think with it, as a teaching community, if we're going to move forward as a profession, it needs to be constructive dialogue that we have on these things, rather than kind of, I think there's a tendency sometimes for it to be dismissive, and I'm probably guilty of that myself sometimes. I'm not going to hold myself up as some kind of bastion of someone who's better, but actually there are differing voices that are really important, and we've got to, if we're going to shift education forward, which we absolutely want to do, and we're in this, we need to shift it forward, but we also need to make sure it is a desirable profession that people want to come to, because we know that if anyone's seen the figures in terms of ITT recruitment, obviously this year they are down. There's something quite unattractive about our profession at the moment, and therefore arguing amongst ourselves is probably not helping the situation.
Yeah, we said there about kind of being quite close-minded, dogmatic around teaching approaches. What do you think teachers can do to stay open to new ideas and approaches, Andrew, just to finish off?
Yeah, I think the thing that needs to happen, two things. The thing that we certainly advocate for our ECTs and ITTs and all our teachers is that you've got to be reflective, and you've got to try and, let's say, if we're looking at kind of education research, we've got to try and look at a whole plethora of that. Coming back to that research thing, you've got to look at the whole spectrum of research rather than just maybe small sections, and that can be hard. You've actually got to do it, because actually there is plenty of research that says that, obviously, let's take cognitive load theory. Now, cognitive load theory is obviously important in the classroom, and that's great, and obviously making sure that you design your lessons and your instructional approach so you're taking on board the cognitive load of students is really important. However, there are lots and lots of other things that are really important. So I think I saw something the other day that suggested, because of cognitive load, what you'd need to do in a classroom is you need to have every wall completely white, and it being the most undesirable class ever, because obviously that's the way to reduce that cognitive load. But, well, actually, yeah, great, it absolutely is. But we also need students to value learning. So you also need students to have self-efficacy, so pride in things. So yeah, putting their work on the board, there's just obviously an example. So putting their work on your wall, yeah, you know that might reduce their cognitive load slightly, but what you do know also is it's going to give them a greater level of self-efficacy, because obviously they've taken pride in their work. You might have a picture, I don't know, of when you've gone on a trip somewhere, okay? Because actually I want them to value this experience. I want them to feel safe in this classroom. I want them to feel nurtured, because those things are really important as well, because if they don't feel those things, then that in itself is going to increase the load on their memory, and therefore make learning less likely to happen. So I think it's like I just said, I think there is a danger of people who aren't in the classroom taking the theory sometimes and forgetting that actually there are very different practical things that need to happen in the classroom. And I think that's a danger. And I think as senior leaders, potentially sometimes, I know I can be guilty of that, because I teach less now. So actually I've got to be always mindful of, right, will this work for my teacher who has got 10% PPA and needs to mark loads of bookings and has got 3 GCSE classes? So taking it, but obviously thinking about what practical things need to happen.
Sure. Yeah, some really interesting points there. Just to kind of summarize, Andrew, any kind of final remarks for our listeners? If you were to give them one bit of advice on curriculum assessment, how would you summarize that?
I think my one bit of advice is take your time, and that learning takes time, because having that understanding that actually learning takes time, and you're going to need to spend time if you want to make sure they learn it is really important. And that is difficult, and it does mean you're going to have to make sacrifices in terms of what you can cover. But actually, if your end goal is to have kind of durable and meaningful and learning that they can use in different contexts, then that it has to be a priority, that you're actually making sure they're learning it. And actually, if again, I'll come back to that example. If I'm going to do Weimar Germany in one lesson, well, there's probably no point in doing it, because actually they're not going to learn it, and you're just wasting valuable time. And actually, every lesson counts, and those minutes for you, for the students, are exceptionally precious. So actually, all the decisions you make are very powerful. But I would add to this that obviously the teaching profession is really, really difficult. Learning is really, really difficult. And actually, what we need to always be mindful is these are our current best bets, and actually things might change.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining me tonight. I'm sure our listeners will have listened with great interest, and I'm sure those that are listening on streaming services will be in touch with you at future dates. And again, you can find Andrew Whitworth on Twitter and other socials. Well worth checking out, having a look at some of his research, bite-sized materials that are on there. But thank you ever so much for joining me tonight, Andrew. I hope you have a wonderful summer holiday, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was great. Bye.
Bye now. Bye.